Shikamo jina langu ni Peyton Boyce. Nina furaha kukutana na wewe. So I chose Kenya as my country to study and present about here. Definitely one of the more interesting and well-known African countries, especially to us Westerners. You know, you've got the particular strand of Starbucks and medium whole roast beans, which are called Kenya. You've got the Maasai people, which are incredibly well documented, and I'm sure as most of us are anthropologists, we've at least talked about in some capacity in previous anthropology courses, or maybe even heard about the Kenyan people through the Olympic runners, which we'll definitely talk about later. It's an interesting topic. But I wanted to start here with the geographical makeup, the physical geography of Kenya, just so we all have the same mental image of the country we're talking about. So it definitely has an interesting geographical layout to it. It's just interesting. It's located in East Africa, next to Central Africa, obviously. It's bordered by Somalia, which is an important point we'll talk about later. Also has borders with Ethiopia, South Sudan, Uganda, and Tanzania. It has a notable coast on the Indian Ocean to its east there. It's an interesting country, geographically speaking, because it has a lot of world's largest and world's only landmarks, that type of stuff, such as Lake Victoria. It has a sizable coastline on Lake Victoria, which is the second largest freshwater lake in the world, second only to Lake Superior here in the U.S. Also, Mount Kenya is in Kenya, obviously, which is the second tallest mountain in Africa, second to Kilimanjaro. It also has a lot of game reserves, a ton, 54 national nature reserves and game reserves, which is interesting because a lot of them are border with big cities, such as Nairobi, which is the only city in the world which has a game and nature reserve within the city limits, technically. So a lot of these reserves have, those interesting backgrounds of like big savannas, but then huge cities in the background, skyline. It's definitely interesting. Also, between Kenya and Tanzania is the Great Migration, which if you've heard of National Geographic, you've definitely heard of the Great Migration. It's the world's largest migration of animals in the world. It happens every year, and they go from Tanzania into Kenya. Interesting point is Kenya sits along the East African coast, or East African Rift, which stretches from the Red Sea down to Mozambique, which technically means Kenya has volcanoes, but almost all of them are Holocene or extinct, and Holocene just means dormant, they're not going to explode. The last major eruption was 110 years ago, I think. Because of the East African Rift, to the east, you're going to see all the savannas and valleys and big plains, the grassiness, kind of Lion King-ish. And then to the west, you have the highlands. And then the rift also causes a lot of narrow and slivery lakes, kind of like needle lakes. It's interesting shape to them, kind of like, you get my point. Such as Lake Turkana, which is the largest desert lake in the world. Like I said, a lot of world's largest type stuff. Might also be the world's largest alkaline lake. Not proven yet. Kenya also has, relative to Africa itself, has an incredibly complex road and railway infrastructure, largely due to the British Empire when they colonized them. That was the big point of them, is setting up intricate railroad lines. So they have a lot of roads and railways that connect to neighboring countries, as well as just throughout the entire country. Kenya itself is made up of 47 semi-autonomous counties. The capital and largest city, Nairobi, is its own county. The two other big cities in Kenya would be Mombasa and Nakuru. Onto the population here, roughly 50 million people live in Kenya. A big issue they're facing with the 50 million people is 40% of the population is under the age of 15, which is incredible to think about, but that's a big issue. 40% of the population under the age of 15. The population is made up of about 47-ish tribes, maybe more, maybe less, but generally 47 is consensus. But the majority of those tribes, the 47 tribes, are categorized into two different people. 67% of the tribes are considered Bantu people, and then 30% are considered Nilotic, with the remaining 3% of the population being a very varied assortment of Cushitic, Arab, Europeans, Chinese, which is something we'll talk about later, as well as Indians. Indians remained, there's a small Indian population because when the British Empire colonized them, they brought over Indian slaves and workers to build the railways, so a lot of Indians remained there after. As far as the culture of Kenya goes, it's kind of like the U.S., where it's hard to say a single U.S. culture per se. Instead, Kenya's culture is comprised of the 47 tribes, which are each have their unique traits, trades, and traditions to them. Like, such as, sorry, let me flip this here. The Kikuyu are known as good businessmen and often, run businesses. The Luo are known to be good politicians and musicians, serious musicians. Interesting fact is President Obama's dad is actually from the Luo, or belongs to the Luo tribe. They're very proud of that. They talk about it a lot. The Kisai are mainly tea farmers, which is a huge export. I'll talk about it later. The Kalenjin are the famous runners. These are talking about the runners. When you think of Kenya, it's actually mainly talking about the Kalenjin tribe, where nearly 80% of Olympic gold medalist athletes in running sports, 80% of gold medalist athletes hail from this tribe. The Kamba are great pottery and carving artists. The Rendile are desert nomads. There's the tribe that are just known as good rugby players. So they're all kind of, they have their own spheres of the culture which they occupy, and I wouldn't say control, but that's their niche. The most famous, of course, is the Maasai people. You've definitely heard of them if you're an anthropologist. They're incredibly well documented, the most well documented tribe in the world, especially from Africa. They're semi-nomadic herders. The reason they're so interesting to anthropologists is because they largely keep to their traditional life of their nomadic traditional lifestyle. They live near the Great Lakes and all the reserves. It's an interesting outlook, or introspective, into the traditional African tribal lifestyle. Also, in a more contemporary issue, a lot of their land is being encroached on by the modern world, so for anthropologists it's interesting to see how that plays out, and it's a good look on something we don't really see anymore. The language, I tried to speak a little bit after in the beginning there. The two languages of Kenya are Kiswahili and English, of course. Kiswahili a lot of it is borrowed from Arabic. Swahili itself means coast, so Kiswahili means the coastal language, basically. Talk about the economy. The service sector and tourism are the largest. They make up 60% of the GDP of Kenya, even with big terrorist issues, which I'll talk about later. The next largest sector is agriculture, which makes it makes up a lot of the rest of it. Kenya is actually the third largest tea producer in the world, second to India and China. Kenya is considered the economic hub of East and, to a lesser extent, Central Africa, but it's definitely a financial hub for everyone. It's kind of a well-developed and big business area. They're famous for things like M-Pesa, which is an online banking service used by millions globally. There's also an interesting system they have, which they're kind of known for, is called Chama, or table banking, which essentially is a group of friends will pool their money and will then loan it out to each other. It's incredibly interesting. I don't know if I'd ever trust someone with my money like that, but we'll talk about Kenya in the media here. So they aren't depicted in a good light, especially on travel advisory sites. So if you Google Kenya news, a lot of recent articles will talk about terrorism. There's a group which are suspected to be based in Somalia, called the Al-Shabaab. They reportedly have ties to Al-Qaeda, and they have been causing a lot of issues in Kenya, so there's a huge news coverage on that right now. In fact, recently the Kenyan president asked many churches, like, help us fight this, help us fight these extremists. Many travel advisory sites don't paint a good picture of Kenya. The U.S. Department of State's travel advisory classifies Kenya as a level 2 warning, which is, you practice more caution, with a lot of areas being considered level 4, which is just a flat out do not go to. Those areas are mainly along the Somalian border and the coast along the Indian Ocean. That's largely due to pirates and a lot of Somalian terrorists and issues. There's also a lot of media coverage on political corruptness, which is something to deal with, which is actually part of the reason why the 47 semi-autonomous counties are becoming more, having more agency recently. They're becoming more autonomous. Also, an interesting point in the media is they talk a lot about China, which is going to be the substantive area of my paper. So I talk a lot about China and Kenya. I open with Chinese businessmen in Kenya. So there's about 40,000 Chinese people living in Kenya. That's the estimated population, which is up from 10,000 roughly 6 years ago. So in 6 years, nearly 30,000, 400% population increase over the past 6 years, which is insane. And that's a big issue because there's a lot of reports coming out, especially from a couple years ago. There was a post, a New Yorker article, which talked about these Chinese businessmen being incredibly racist and discriminatory toward Kenyan workers. And where, first of all, racism and discrimination is bad in its own right, obviously, but the issue is these Chinese businessmen come over with leverage or positions of power over the Kenyan workers, so they'll often be like managers, or just they'll have authority over Kenyan workers, and they exploit them in that way, and use their authority to be racist and discriminatory and call them derogatory names like monkey, things like that, horrible things, and they get away with it because they have the position of authority and power. They have the leverage. So that's been a huge issue, and it's a big concern of Kenyan people at the moment. But the big thing I talk about is China is essentially recolonizing Kenya and a lot of parts of Africa right now. In fact, a lot of Chinese media, touts it as colonization 2.0, which is insane to think about because we only look back at colonization as a horrible thing, But and I think we can trust Chinese media because almost all of it's controlled by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. But yeah, I talk a lot about their efforts to colonize it, and that comes in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which is essentially their plan to create a new Silk Road, a huge trading route, which will just, expand trading, all that, make it so good for everyone, but in reality, they would have complete control over these countries. And part of that is China's debt trap diplomacy. So what that is essentially. So here's what just for example, in Kenya, Kenya currently, they even paid off part of their loan, but they currently owe about $9.8 billion to China, which is an amount that Kenya could never repay, and China knew this, giving out the loan to Kenya, and so essentially what they're doing is they're giving out loans that they know the receiver can't repay, in this case Kenya, and it might be ostensibly a gift of charity or whatever. They want to look like the nice guy, but in reality what they're doing is when Kenya can't pay off the huge loan, which they inevitably can't, when they can't pay it off, China will take over key assets or infrastructure. In this case, Kenya is at risk of losing the Mombasa port. The port in Mombasa, which is the largest they have, and it's the largest in East Africa, along the East African coast. It's the largest. China is essentially threatening to take that over and, own that piece of infrastructure, which is a huge issue. And they're doing that to many countries, not only Kenya, a lot of African countries along the East Coast, and a lot of Middle Eastern countries. They're also trying to India, but that didn't work out. But so basically, I look at all this and I think about the implications it has based on China's previous excursions with its own people, and historical evidence of colonization in Kenya. And the big thing I look at is the way China treats its own people, especially Hong Kong. And if you don't know about Hong Kong, basically, the British had Hong Kong as a colony up until about 1997 or 1999, and they gave it back to China, mainland China. But they agreed for 99 years, 99 or 50, irrelevant because China broke the promise, but they agreed to a one country, two systems, where basically Hong Kong would be allowed to remain autonomous, separate from the CCP. But unfortunately, almost immediately, China broke that promise and tried to exert its power over the people of Hong Kong. A lot of things, like Hong Kong has a democratic voting system, and basically China came in and said, you can only vote for people that we pre-approve, which is essentially them saying you can only, you can't vote. We pick the people. That was a huge issue recently, about 2014. There's been other issues, such as Hong Kong has its own language, Mandarin, while meanwhile mainland China speaks Cantonese, but mainland China, or Beijing, I'll call it Beijing because that's equivalent of Washington D.C. in China. But Beijing is essentially forcing Hong Kong children to learn Cantonese over Mandarin. It's things like that pushing Hong Kong culture out of Hong Kong, making it part of mainland China. And I look at things like that and apply it to Kenya, and I speculate on that. Big thing I talk about is religion, because the CCP is officially atheist, and to be a part of the party, to be a party member, you have to be atheist. You have to declare yourself atheist. And so I look at that and think, what would that do to Kenya, which is which has a huge Christian population, and most people are religious in some way. I also the big thing about that is the Uyghur issue. The Uyghur genocide essentially is what it is in China, where China is killed or locked up millions. They put them in camps. Millions of Uyghur people, which are essentially Muslim or Islamic people in China. And I just look at all that and I apply it to what would happen if China continues its colonization efforts in Kenya. Think about what would happen to the people, what could happen. One of the big outcomes of the British colonizing Kenya was the importance of tribalism, or the emphasis on tribes in Kenya. A lot of the sources I looked at claimed tribes weren't so prominent or so different before the British colonized them, but now there's a lot of tribal conflict. It's gone down, but it's still prevalent in some capacity. So I can only help but wonder what would happen if China colonized Kenya. That's essentially what my paper was about. The big focal point is China colonizing Kenya, using the Belt and Road Initiative as an excuse, and using the debt trap diplomacy, making Kenya the third most indebted country to China. They still at this moment owe $9.8 billion US. They can't repay it. They've appealed to the World Bank for help, but we'll see what happens. We'll see if they lose the Mombasa port. But that's it. Asante ni.